Viewer discretion advised. Images are used for illustration purposes only. From the outside, the Staudte home in Springfield, Missouri looked like any other quiet, middle-class house in suburban America. There were children's toys in the backyard, seasonal decorations on the front porch, and a string of wind chimes dancing in the summer breeze. It was the kind of place that made neighbors feel comfortable, safe, unshaken by the chaos that too often erupted in other parts of the country. No one expected tragedy to brew within its walls, but behind those modest curtains and family photos, something far darker was taking root. Mark Staudte was a father of 5. He played in a local blues band and had a laid-back charm about him, a man who preferred music and beer over ambition and confrontation. He wasn't perfect, but no one saw him as dangerous or abusive. His wife, Diane Staudte, was the real backbone of the household, a mother of 5 and a church-going woman who worked hard as a nurse. She was always composed, seemingly devout, and rarely raised her voice. She played the role of the matriarch with eerie precision. Together they had 5 children: Rachel, Sarah, Sean, Brianna, and the youngest, a toddler whose name rarely surfaced in news reports. The family was large, quirky, and from the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Until one night in April 2012. Mark was found unresponsive in the bathroom. He had been vomiting, shaking, and showing signs of severe dehydration and confusion. Diane calmly called 911. When the paramedics arrived, she told them Mark had been battling flu-like symptoms for days and refused to see a doctor. It didn't take long before he was pronounced dead. The cause? According to the death certificate, natural causes, likely organ failure linked to chronic alcohol abuse. No autopsy, no suspicion. Case closed. Friends and neighbors offered their condolences. The church supported the grieving widow, and Diane, now a single mother, carried on with life as though death was just a sad but passing phase. But something didn't sit right. There was no emotion, no trembling voice, no tears, only calm, only control. Then 6 months later, tragedy struck again. This time it was Sean, the Staudte's autistic adult son. He was rushed to the hospital after suffering multiple seizures and signs of severe neurological damage. The doctors were baffled. His condition deteriorated rapidly. He lost motor control, speech, memory, everything. After extensive testing, the conclusion was vague: a possible brain infection or stroke. Again, Diane remained composed. Again, she offered little insight. Again, no one questioned her. And just as the dust began to settle, another child collapsed. Sarah, the vibrant, artsy, intelligent daughter, was rushed to the ER with similar symptoms: vomiting, seizures, brain swelling, multiple organs on the brink of failure. But this time, doctors weren't so quick to dismiss the signs. Sarah was only 24 and previously healthy, and while she lay in a coma fighting for her life, the staff at Mercy Hospital began asking questions. They contacted a minister who had known the family for years, and what he said chilled them to the bone. He told them something was off with Diane. She didn't cry at Mark's funeral. She barely visited Sean in rehab. And when he asked her how she was coping, she said verbatim, "It's a relief, honestly. One less mouth to feed." What kind of mother says that? The hospital alerted authorities. A detective quietly opened an investigation. They dug into the timeline, the deaths, the illnesses, and what they uncovered began to form a pattern too disturbing to ignore. 2 family members down, 1 clinging to life, the rest seemingly unharmed. This is The Untold Trace, and I am your host. What happened inside the Staudte family home is one of the most calculated, cold-blooded acts of betrayal ever seen. Not just because of the method, but because of the motive. A mother who weaponized poison. A daughter who helped her. And victims who never saw it coming because they trusted the very hands that served them food, tucked them in, and said, "I love you." Before we dive deeper, I ask you if stories like these matter to you. If uncovering the darkness that hides behind smiling faces is worth your time, then please like, follow, and subscribe to The Untold Trace. And remember to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. These stories deserve to be told. Because behind every perfect family photo, there could be a monster just out of frame. By the time Sarah Staudte was placed in a medically induced coma in early 2013, her body was shutting down from the inside. Her kidneys were barely functioning. Her neurological system was collapsing, and her doctors were stumped. But they were also suspicious. Too many strange coincidences had surrounded this family over the past few months. Two severe health crises following a sudden, unexplained death, all within a single household. And all linked to one woman, Diane Staudte. So a quiet call was made to the Springfield Police Department. It was time to take a closer look. Detectives began by pulling hospital reports and cross-referencing symptoms. When they placed Mark's, Sean's, and Sarah's medical history side by side, a terrifying pattern emerged. Vomiting, headaches, seizures, organ failure. They weren't symptoms of random illness. They were classic signs of ethylene glycol poisoning, the active compound in antifreeze. Why would anyone drink antifreeze? They wouldn't not unless they were forced to. So authorities turned to Diane, hoping to find answers. But instead of panic or grief, Diane responded with cool detachment. She insisted her husband had been a heavy drinker, her son was developmentally disabled, and her daughter was just sickly. She offered explanations that sounded rehearsed and almost too eager to deflect suspicion. Detectives weren't buying it. They obtained a search warrant and entered the Staudte home. Inside, the image of a perfect Christian household began to fall apart. They found multiple bottles of antifreeze hidden in the garage. They found a handwritten journal belonging to Diane filled with odd phrases that felt more like confessions than diary entries. One line stood out. "It's easier this way. They're draining me. I deserve a life too." They also found something far more incriminating. A computer search history filled with phrases like, "How to poison someone without getting caught," "Ethylene glycol side effects," "How long does antifreeze take to kill?" It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was evidence. But Diane wasn't the only one under the microscope. Her daughter, Rachel Staudte, was 22 years old at the time. Quiet, observant, and considered the golden child, Rachel seemed different from the rest. She was Diane's favorite, devoutly religious, clean-cut, and often described as overly obedient. She played in the church band and rarely made waves. But when questioned by detectives, her story began to crumble. At first, Rachel claimed ignorance. She said she didn't know what was happening to her siblings, that she was just as shocked as anyone else. But when detectives leaned in, when they began referencing Diane's journal, in the search history, Rachel's demeanor changed. She asked to speak off the record. She asked for a lawyer. Then, she cracked. Rachel confessed to everything. She said her mother began discussing the plan in early 2012. Diane had grown resentful of her husband and certain children. She viewed Mark as a lazy alcoholic who brought nothing to the table. Sean, who was autistic, required too much care. Sarah, though gifted, challenged her authority. Diane felt they were draining her emotionally, spiritually, and financially. So Diane came up with a plan: poison them one by one. And Rachel agreed to help. Together they mixed antifreeze into drinks, sometimes into sweet tea, sometimes into sodas or energy drinks. Diane was careful not to overdo it, just enough to weaken them slowly, over days. She wanted it to look like illness, like organ failure, like death from natural causes. And it worked. First came Mark. His death was quick blamed on his lifestyle and alcohol abuse. No one questioned it. Then came Sean. The dosage was smaller. He didn't die, but he would never be the same. He was left brain damaged, unable to live independently, unable to speak clearly. Next was Sarah, intelligent, funny, artistic. Sarah, the daughter Diane once called too difficult. She nearly died, but Sarah was strong. She fought through the coma, and when she finally woke up, it was as if the darkness had failed to finish its work. But Diane wasn't done. According to Rachel, the next target would have been Brianna, the youngest daughter. And that's what broke Rachel. The idea of harming her little sister, it was too much. Her full confession sent shockwaves through the community. How could a mother do this? How could a daughter go along with it? When Diane was brought in for questioning again, she remained stoic until she learned Rachel had confessed. Then, in a cold, flat tone, She admitted everything. They were just too much. I couldn't handle it anymore. I wanted peace. Those were her words. Peace. But what kind of peace comes from poisoning your own blood? The Staudte murders weren't crimes of passion. They weren't fueled by rage or sudden impulse. They were slow, methodical, planned, executed over months with terrifying patience. Diane smiled at her children while pouring their drinks. She tucked them into bed, kissed their foreheads while poison bloomed silently in their veins. And she didn't blink. Rachel, though less involved, played her part. She helped mix the antifreeze. She watched her father die. She sat by while her brother lost his mind, and she said nothing. The world now saw the Staudte family for what it really was. A house not of peace but of poison. A place where love was conditional, where survival depended on silence, and where innocence was slowly and silently murdered, one teacup at a time. When the truth about the Staudte family poisoning finally broke, Springfield, Missouri didn't just shudder, it reeled. News vans flooded the quiet suburban street where the house once stood as a symbol of ordinary life. Neighbors who had waved at Diane while she mowed her lawn or watched her take her children to church couldn't believe the monster that had been living right among them. And yet, she wasn't wearing a mask. She wasn't hiding in shadows. She wasn't stalking strangers. She was feeding her own children poison in plain sight. The public was stunned, but the damage had already been done. Inside the hospital, Sarah Staudte finally opened her eyes. She had survived, but barely. Her muscles were weak. Her memory was fractured. She could barely speak and had no idea just how close she had come to dying. Her doctors, already burdened with the truth, couldn't tell her right away. How do you look a daughter in the eyes and tell her, her own mother did this? But Sarah would eventually learn, and the weight of that truth shattered what was left of her trust in the world. Sean Staudte, on the other hand, would never fully comprehend what happened. The poison had done irreversible damage to his brain. He would require full-time care for the rest of his life. He wouldn't return home because home was where death had found him. His future, once full of gentle routines and autism-managed growth, had been violently stripped away not by accident, not by fate, but by deliberate betrayal. Mark Staudte was already gone, buried, cremated. He would never get the justice he deserved, but he wasn't forgotten. Detectives worked with forensic experts to revisit the initial cause of death and confirm what they already suspected. Mark had been poisoned, first a test case perhaps. He had been written off as an alcoholic. But now everyone knew. His last drink wasn't beer. It was laced with death. So why did Diane do it? Investigators and psychologists scrambled to put the pieces together. There was no insurance money involved, no clear financial windfall, no history of physical abuse or trauma that might explain such monstrous acts. What they found instead was something even more unsettling. Diane was simply tired of her family. She viewed them as burdens. In her mind, Mark was dead weight. Sean required too much care. Sarah had too much personality. She wanted a peaceful life, one where she could raise only the children she liked and have freedom from the rest. She even made plans to go on vacation shortly after Sarah was hospitalized. It wasn't about money. It was about control, convenience, power. And Diane wielded that power with surgical precision. Rachel, on the other hand, was more complex. In her confession, she wept. She admitted guilt. She admitted fear. She said she trusted her mother blindly, had been manipulated, and didn't understand the full gravity of what they were doing. But detectives weren't sure. Yes, Rachel was young and impressionable, but she had searched how to poison. She had helped serve the drinks. She had watched her siblings deteriorate without raising alarm. And she stayed silent, until she feared Brianna, her favorite sibling, was next. Was it fear that made her speak up, or was it guilt? Either way, the court didn't offer her a free pass. The charges came down swiftly. Diane Staudte was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of first-degree assault. Rachel Staudte faced second-degree murder charges, as well as assault and attempted murder. In court, Diane showed little emotion. She pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No tears, no apologies, just silence. Rachel, on the other hand, cooperated fully. Her attorney painted her as a manipulated daughter, a follower caught in her mother's spell. She was eventually sentenced to 42 and a half years in prison with the possibility of parole. But to the public, even that felt like mercy. What broke people the most wasn't just the act, it was who committed it. Mothers are supposed to protect their children. They're supposed to shield them from harm, not serve it to them in a glass of Gatorade. And daughters? They're supposed to warn, to cry, to run for help, not sit at the table and pass the poison. This case haunted everyone. It touched the nurses who treated Sarah, the detective who cracked the story, the minister who first raised suspicions. Every one of them had been fooled by a woman who wore her religion like armor, who smiled through her crimes, who slept soundly beside death. And still, there was one more chilling truth buried in the aftermath. No one had ever suspected Diane. Not really. She didn't scream, she didn't hit, she didn't isolate or threaten her kids in front of others. She blended in. A perfectly average suburban mom with polite manners and church attendance. That's what made her so terrifying. Because monsters don't always knock down doors. Sometimes they tuck you into bed. If this story chills you to the bone, if you believe it's important to uncover the truths hiding behind the masks of everyday life, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. This is The Untold Trace, and our mission is to speak for those who couldn't, and expose those who thought they'd never be caught. When the final gavel dropped and the courtroom emptied, the haunting echo of the Staudte case didn't just fade. It lingered in hospital rooms, in classrooms, in sermons delivered at local churches, a constant reminder that evil can live in plain sight. There were no masked intruders, no breaking windows, just a mother, a daughter, and a slow, invisible poison that destroyed lives from the inside out. In the weeks following Diane and Rachel's sentencing, Springfield tried to breathe again, but there was a suffocating silence over the community. Teachers who once taught Rachel and Sarah couldn't understand how two girls raised in the same home could turn out so differently. Church members who once sat beside Diane in prayer were now questioning how they ever believed in her. And close friends who'd visited the Staudte home remembered moments, subtle, forgettable moments that now seemed like red flags in hindsight. One neighbor who used to see Mark barbecuing in the yard recalled how he had started to lose weight rapidly before his death, how his eyes seemed yellowed, how Diane once joked that he was rotting from the inside. It wasn't a joke. That neighbor cried during her interview. Not because she had known what was happening, but because she hadn't. Because like everyone else, she saw what she was meant to see. Diane Staudte didn't wear her darkness. She polished it. Meanwhile, Sarah's recovery was far from over. The poison had ravaged her body. She required physical therapy, cognitive rehabilitation, and psychological counseling. She struggled to form clear sentences. Her memory came and went like broken glass on a shoreline, some pieces sharp, others simply missing. But the emotional damage, that lingered most. How do you process the idea that your own mother tried to erase you? Sarah had been the bright one. She had studied at university. She played music. She had dreams. But her life was now defined by something she never saw coming, the betrayal of blood. In an interview years later, Sarah sat calmly beside her attorney, her speech slow but confident. When asked what hurt the most, she didn't mention the coma, or the needles, or the brain damage. She said, "It's that my mom looked me in the eye and still fed me the drink. I smiled at her. I thanked her. I didn't know she was trying to kill me." There are no words to reconcile that kind of betrayal. No healing that fully removes the scars. As for Sean, the damage was even more permanent. He would never regain full independence. His life was now structured around caretakers and long-term facilities. And though he occasionally smiled or hummed, the spark that once lived behind his eyes had dimmed. Stolen. He didn't have the words to explain his pain, and maybe that was the cruelest twist of all. He couldn't even say his own mother's name without help. The state stepped in to care for Brianna. the youngest child, who had narrowly escaped the plot. She was placed with foster guardians, shielded from the chaos, but not from the truth. She would grow up knowing what her mother had done, what her sister had helped do, and she would have to carry that knowledge like a shadow. Imagine growing up with the reality that your family wasn't taken from you by a fire or a car crash, but by a spoonful of antifreeze in a cold glass. The case also changed how medical professionals in Springfield approached unexplained illnesses. Hospitals implemented new protocols for screening potential poisoning cases, especially when symptoms matched neurological or organ failure patterns. Nurses and doctors began raising red flags faster. They questioned odd behavior more often, because the Staudte case taught them something vital. Not all killers raise their voices. Some just refill your cup. At the Springfield Police Department, the lead detective on the case, Neil McCamus, kept the Staudte case file open on his desk for months. Not because the case was unfinished, but because it haunted him. In interviews, he admitted it wasn't the violence that got to him. It was the calm, the precision, the way Diane had prepared sandwiches while her children were vomiting in their rooms, the way Rachel attended church after her father's death like nothing had happened. There was no panic, no remorse, just routine. It wasn't just a murder. It was a lifestyle. And the question that kept coming back, the one that haunted so many, was this: how many people sat across from Diane Staudte and smiled at her while she was planning another death? People wondered if they missed it, the signs, the cracks. Some blamed themselves for not calling the police sooner. Others felt relief that they weren't targeted. But one universal emotion kept rising above the rest: horror. Not just at the act itself, but at how ordinary it all looked, how long it took to unravel. Because if it took months for people to realize what Diane was doing, how many other homes are hiding similar truths? Time has passed since the truth about Diane and Rachel Staudte rocked the quiet streets of Springfield, Missouri. The neighborhood where their house once stood has moved on, at least on the surface. New families live there now. Children ride bikes down the same sidewalks. Dogs bark from familiar porches. But the air, if you listen closely, still hums with a cold memory. Because the ground beneath that house doesn't just hold plumbing and foundation. It holds secrets. It holds silence. And it holds a story that shattered everything we thought we understood about safety, motherhood, and evil. Diane Staudte is now serving life without parole at the Women's Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Vandalia, Missouri. She's not a headline anymore. She's just another number, another mugshot in the prison system. But even behind bars, her legacy endures not as a cautionary tale of madness, but as a calculated reminder that cruelty doesn't always come screaming. It comes dressed in patience. It comes with bedtime prayers and casserole dishes and birthday cards. It comes with a smile that tells you nothing's wrong until everything is. And as the years rolled on, people began to ask the inevitable question: why didn't anyone stop her sooner? The autopsy that was never done, the dismissal of Sean's condition as random misfortune, the church community that praised Diane's strength without noticing her detachment, the teachers who didn't question why Sarah missed so many days of school toward the end, the medical staff who initially missed the poison. No one acted maliciously. No one meant to overlook the signs, but they did. And that's what makes this story so terrifying. Because Diane didn't hide her crimes with force. She hid them with familiarity, with routine. She was the mother, the caregiver, the wife. People don't question those roles even when they should. Sarah, the survivor with both mental and physical scars, eventually cut all ties with her mother and sister. She tried to start over, to reclaim her life. She gave interviews when she was strong enough, not for fame, but for clarity. To tell people the truth no one saw coming. She became a quiet advocate, not on stages or in courtrooms, but through her very existence, through survival. And that survival wasn't easy. Every day, Sarah woke up with the knowledge that she had been poisoned intentionally by the woman who gave her life, the woman who was supposed to protect her. She didn't speak about forgiveness. She spoke about endurance, about rebuilding her sense of worth from the ground up. Because when someone tries to erase you and fails the life you rebuild, is no longer for them. It's for you. As for Rachel, her story became more complicated in the years that followed. Some saw her as a co-victim manipulated by a mother she trusted. Others saw her as a willing participant, someone old enough to know right from wrong and still chose wrong. In prison, she reportedly showed remorse. She kept to herself. She didn't seek the spotlight. But remorse does not erase action, and time does not erase consequence. The law held her accountable, and history won't forget her name. But perhaps the most sobering part of the Staudte case is the way it exposed the fragility of family. The illusion that blood guarantees safety. That just because someone raises you, they won't also ruin you. This wasn't about wealth or power or jealousy. It was about convenience. Diane decided that certain members of her family were burdens, and so she slowly, methodically eliminated them. She didn't stab, she didn't shoot, she poured drinks. And that's what made her so hard to catch, because love and poison don't usually come from the same pair of hands. In the wake of the case, medical institutions in Missouri began reevaluating how they handle unexplained symptoms, especially when multiple members of a family fall ill. Poison awareness became a larger focus in nursing programs. Police departments began partnering more actively with hospitals when strange cases popped up, because they learned the hard way that murder doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, over days, weeks, months, and sometimes it comes from within. For the rest of us, those who read about this case, who watch stories like these, who try to understand the minds behind such chilling decisions, the lesson is heavier. It's not just about Diane, it's about what she represents. The uncomfortable truth is this: evil isn't always violent. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's methodical, polite, dressed in quiet smiles and freshly folded laundry. Sometimes the killer doesn't lurk in the alley. Sometimes she's at the head of the dinner table. And that's why this story matters. Because for every person who thought their pain was too small to matter, for every nurse who second-guessed their instincts, for every child who wondered if something in their home didn't feel quite right, the Staudte case reminds us: trust your gut, question the narrative, speak, because silence is where monsters grow. This is The Untold Trace, and I thank you for walking through this devastating journey with us. If this story moved you, opened your eyes, or made you feel something that lingers beyond the final word, please like, comment, and subscribe. And check out our other videos that explore the darker truths beneath the surface of everyday life. Because these stories aren't just about death, they're about revelation. And sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that start with, "I love you." What turns a mother into a murderer? It's the question that haunted not just Springfield, Missouri, but forensic psychologists, criminologists, and journalists across the country. Diane Staudte didn't fit the mold. She wasn't volatile. She didn't have a violent history. She wasn't a known narcissist, sociopath, or monster in the traditional sense. She volunteered at church. She smiled at neighbors. She never once raised a hand in public. But behind the civility was a calculating mind, one that quietly justified the slow destruction of her own family. In interviews conducted post-conviction, forensic psychologists described Diane as a high-functioning malignant pragmatist, someone whose decisions were governed entirely by cold, internal logic. She didn't kill out of hatred. She killed because the presence of her husband and certain children no longer aligned with her goals. To her, it was simple. They were obstacles, and like any inconvenience, she removed them. Her confession was eerie in its calmness. No tears, no sense of moral conflict, just matter-of-fact statements like, "They were holding me back. I didn't want to struggle anymore." What makes that so chilling isn't just the thought itself, but how commonplace it was in her mind. Diane didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as rational. Even in court, her posture never cracked. Where other killers trembled in orange jumpsuits or stared blankly into space, Diane sat straight, unshaken. The only time she reportedly flinched was when her surviving daughter, Sarah, entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, the result of the very poison Diane had slipped into her drink. But she didn't cry. She didn't mouth, "Sorry." She looked away. And that is where the fear lies, in the capacity for ordinary people to become architects of horror through internal justifications. Rachel's case was far more psychologically layered. Experts suggested she showed signs of coerced complicity, not full-fledged brainwashing, but a dependent personality warped by years of emotional grooming. She worshipped her mother, wanted to please her, feared disappointing her. And in that dynamic, the line between loyalty and criminality blurred dangerously. But Rachel wasn't a child. She knew what antifreeze was. She Googled the symptoms. She watched her father die. She remained silent. Her guilt was real. Her regret was visible. But that didn't absolve her. In the eyes of the law, and to many of the people watching, she crossed a line she could never uncross. Public reactions to the case were visceral. News anchors described it as one of the most chilling domestic murder plots of the decade. Community forums lit up with disbelief. Some defended Rachel as a manipulated pawn. Others saw her as a co-conspirator who deserved no sympathy. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Diane Staudte was a different breed of killer. Not impulsive, not angry, just cold. Some compared her to Belle Gunness, the early 20th century Black Widow who poisoned suitors for insurance money. Others invoked Darlie Routier or Susan Smith women whose crimes shattered the illusion of maternal instinct. But Diane wasn't like them. There was no meltdown, no panic, no confessions sparked by guilt. She simply stopped talking when caught. In a strange twist, the Staudte case also sparked renewed national debate over the visibility of psychological abuse, especially emotional control within households. Diane didn't scream at her children or beat them. She didn't isolate them in basements or withhold food. She controlled through subtleties, favoritism, passive aggression, detachment, and when she no longer wanted them in her life, she made them disappear. It forced mental health professionals to confront an uncomfortable reality. Not all abusers are loud. Some are polite, some are quiet. Some bring you soup when you're sick and stir the poison in with a plastic spoon. The case also reignited conversations about how gender biases influence investigations. Would authorities have moved faster if the suspect were a man? Would the medical staff have investigated sooner if a father had shown that much emotional detachment? Would a male suspect with the same search history have been arrested after the first death? No one could say for sure, but the conversation was worth having. Meanwhile, Sarah's voice, though quiet, became the most powerful echo from this case. In her first public statement, released through a lawyer, she wrote, "I lived. My brother didn't. My father didn't. I can't bring them back, but I can use what happened to me to remind people. Monsters don't always live under your bed. Sometimes they tuck you in." It was devastating and true. Sarah would go on to earn sympathy and support from thousands. Donations, letters, community groups offering resources. And yet she chose a path of privacy. She didn't attend TV interviews. She didn't monetize her trauma. She simply focused on healing. To this day, her whereabouts remain private, a shield she earned the hard way. As for Sean, his life continued quietly under state care. Those close to the case say he enjoys music, laughs sometimes, and can still recognize people he knew from before. But the bright young man he once was is gone. His future was stolen not by time but by betrayal. The final question that lingers over this case isn't why. We already know the why. It's how many more are out there. How many seemingly perfect families hide similar fractures? How many mothers or fathers are silently unraveling beneath the pressure of expectations, debt, or mental illness? How many people feel trapped in lives they never asked for and might someday act on that feeling? The Staudte case isn't just about one woman who went too far. It's about how silence, secrecy, and misplaced trust can create perfect conditions for quiet destruction. It's about the danger of not asking questions. At The Untold Trace, we tell these stories not to frighten you but to wake you up. To remind you that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it smiles in the church pew next to you. Sometimes it calls itself mom. If this final chapter of the Staudte family's nightmare has stirred something in you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, heard, and remembered, then like, comment, subscribe, and share. Help us uncover the truths others are too afraid to face. Because the real monsters, they live among us.